Welcome everyone to the press conference announcing the release of this report, Second Chances Don't Diminish Justice But Fulfill It, the voices of dual victims in Pennsylvania. This report summarizes a survey that was conducted over the last year and a half, conducted by the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration, the Straight Ahead organization, Healing Communities, PA, and South Philly Victim Witness Services. So the purpose of this report was to ask people who are dual victims, that is, they have lost a loved one to violence, and either they themselves have been or are incarcerated, or a loved one has been incarcerated. So they feel the effects of both of these forms of violence. And through the surveying, asking deep and open-ended questions about what healing and justice will look like for people living at these intersections, we think that we are offering a valuable voice in the conversation about how we address gun violence, about how we address mass incarceration at the same time. I'll just speak personally here for a second as a pastor, as someone who has done funerals for people who have, for young people, teenagers who have been killed in drive-by shootings. We need better solutions to gun violence in our neighborhoods. We need solutions that don't just leave victims grieving, don't just leave them asking for answers, and who don't present the only option for them as participation in the criminal legal system and having someone sentenced to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. So just a little order of service here. I'm going to get out of the way and let other folks do the rest of the talking. But first we're going to have Reverend Dr. Chris Jimenez speak. He's a pastor in Philadelphia, the executive director of Healing Communities, PA, and he himself is a dual victim. Then we're going to have Martha Williams speak. Martha, in addition to being a member of CADBI and a dual victim, is also the founder of this survey, the first person to sort of help bring it into existence. And then myself and Sonia Dahl are going to talk a bit about the data and process of this. So if you came here with your data nerd hat on, that's the time when you can ask us questions about how did the survey work? How did you get to the outcomes that you came to, the recommendations? And then Representative Bullock is going to speak, and Representative Krajewski, and Senator Street. And we were going to have an imam from the Council on American Islamic Relations speak. However, they're dealing with a crisis of some Muslim students who were targeted because of their dress in their schools, and so they're not able to be here. Praying for those young people, and I'm glad that they're able to get support from their imam. And then we'll have Amy Mcandrews close us out, who's also a dual victim. So I'm sure you wrote all that down and you've memorized it, but first up we're going to have Reverend Dr. Chris Jimenez.
Good morning, everyone. Chris Jimenez, my last name is spelled Kimmenez. And as Reverend Bergen said, I serve as Executive Director of Healing Communities, PA. We are a faith-based justice transformation organization. So I'm not here this morning only because we were one of the organizations that worked on the project, but also because I am a dual victim. I'm the father of a homicide victim who I have also been formerly incarcerated. And my family, through our faith, made a conscious decision to forgive and to pursue a restorative justice approach rather than a punitive one. Over the years, I kind of began to ask myself, why were our feelings and the feelings of so many other dual victims who believed in second chances sort of left out of the conversation, or left out of the narrative that a lot of times is spun by prosecutors and politicians that say that all victims want punitive justice? To me, it seemed kind of deliberate, and the only victim voices that seemed to be included in the conversations were those who were overwhelmingly punitive and wanted to see either people locked up and thrown away or watch them executed. So after years of kind of dancing around the issue, some research began to happen, and of course, most of you have probably heard of the 2016 National Crime Victim Survey that overwhelmingly majority of victims surveyed in that survey believed in second chances and restoration, rather than the need for punitive justice. And we actually, in that conversation, began to move the needle. But then a report came out from the PA's Office of Victim Advocate that was a huge contradiction to what was happening nationally. And we began to ask the question, what was so different about PA as opposed to the rest of the country? Well, what we found out when we really deep dived into that particular survey is that the majority of the representation in that survey were people who were overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly rural. There was very few, if any, people of color representative, nobody from urban areas, no dual victims. In fact, the previous victim advocate publicly stated that we didn't exist. The dual victims did not exist. And in short, we kind of really felt that it did not reflect our Commonwealth. So this report today is different. It includes all of the people that were previously excluded. It reflects people from all over the Commonwealth, from all ages and walks of life. It reflects people like me that actually exist. It reflects that there are victims who do believe in second chances, and it challenges the narrative that any positive movement on second chances is made at the expense of victims, and that the voices of victims have to be ignored if you're going to work on second chances. That simply isn't true. The only victims that seem to be ignored in this conversation are the voices of people like me and the majority of victims that actually want to see second chances and restorative practices. The motto of the organization that I run is balancing justice with mercy. You can't have one without the other and still call our society just. So my ask, and this is a personal one, this isn't as Executive Director of Healing Communities, but my ask in all this is that we stop exploiting a few people that are still usually overwhelmingly early in the process of healing. Stop exploiting them. Stop trying to spin what they have to say, even though they represent a small fraction of us, and start listening to all of us. Don't ask the question, what about the victims, unless you're ready for the real answer. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martha Williams. I am a member of CADBI, which is the Coalition to Abolish DBI Sentencing, which is in 2022 unnecessary. It does not promote or constitute healing of any kind. It tends to cause more damage than it does healing. Thank you, John, for just mentioning the fact of the survey. The survey came about, some folks were having conversations and wanting both sides to be included. And it's like, well, how do you get, both sides included? Well, you ask them. You ask the people. You ask the people that are hurt. You ask the people that have caused harm, because even in causing harm usually is by someone that was harmed, right? And so if we are not having this collective conversation, how are we to move forward as human beings? What does it mean? Hurt is anybody at any time that's not, it's not healing, all right? And so I didn't prepare anything. You'll have to forgive me. This is, just coming from the point of dual victimship, right? And so dual victimship is losing someone to incarceration, as well as losing someone to a type of harm, because it isn't always resulted in death, right? You have people who are paralyzed by gun violence, and so that's not death, but are they left out of a conversation because they're not deceased? And so we need to be inclusive of everybody. And this conversation needs to be had generally. It's not a one-sided conversation. So I'm not gonna keep y'all. I appreciate the opportunity to speak just for everybody, right? For both sides of this, because there are no winners. You can sentence somebody to life without the possibility of parole for causing harm, and who won? Nobody wins, because behind both parties there are families. And so you're hurting a community, you're hurting a state, you're hurting cities. And so until that is collectively addressed by the same people who are voting, by the same people who are living in these communities, just hoping to bring some change about. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Robert, we've reached the nerdy part of the press conference. So as I mentioned, and then Reverend Chris mentioned as well, our survey began in response to the survey conducted by the Office of Victim Advocate in 2018, not because we thought that survey was incorrect in its findings, but because we knew from our experiences and from our communities that there were other perspectives on death by incarceration and other perspectives on ways in which to address harm and violence in our communities. We also know that particularly Black and Brown victims and Black and Brown victims in cities are disproportionately underrepresented by the OVA, even though they are disproportionately overrepresented in gun violence around the state. And so this survey explores a pretty basic question. If we talk to dual victims about their experiences of losing a loved one to violence, what would they say? And particularly if we ask questions that are open-ended and expand beyond prison is the only answer, what might we hear? So we work collectively with Victim Witness Services, Healing Communities, Straight Ahead, members of CADBI, and a number of other community advisors, some chaplains in the community, and other individuals to collectively design a 20-question survey. We ended up with 104 dual victim responses. And I'll just note here, we're presenting this as a dual victim report. We didn't set out to do that. We set out to talk to victims of violence anywhere and everywhere. We sent surveys to people we knew and connected to in prisons. We went to community events. We connected with victims groups across the state. But what we found, because of the ways that we asked these open-ended questions, was that the vast majority of people who responded were not just impacted by gun violence, but were also impacted by incarceration. That's not a coincidence, right? Violence occurs within community, and incarceration affects people who are also impacted by violence. So last thing I'll say here, out of those 104 responses that we detail in this report, 50 of those responses are people who are currently incarcerated, 20 are those people who are formerly incarcerated. About 4 out of 5 respondents are Black, 3 out of 5 are from Philly County, and only 14% of those who responded are registered with the OVA. And as detailed in the report, we think that these numbers they line up relatively well with homicide numbers for the whole state and for incarceration numbers for the whole state. So while it's not exactly representative of who dual victims are across the state, we do think it's a fairly representative survey. And to say more about that, I'll let Sonia take over.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So I want to start talking about the results from the survey by encouraging you all to take a look at some of these quotes on the end. Those are just a couple of the responses that dual victims had to the long answer questions in our survey. So in our survey, dual victims shared about the pain and the grief they've experienced in losing a loved one to violence. On a personal note, it was actually kind of hard to read at times because people were really speaking from the heart. Many of the folks who answered our survey were looking for healing outside of the criminal legal system, the things that were within reach for them. So things like counseling, religious and spiritual practice, simply letting time pass. Most had things that they would like to say to the person who took their loved one's life, whether that was offering forgiveness, seeking understanding, or something else. And then several voiced that ultimately healing would mean rebuilding community, it would mean accountability, it would mean addressing the root causes of violence. And so for the dual victims that we surveyed, healing and justice were really interrelated. When we asked them about what justice means to them, the most common answer was not prison, it was rehabilitation of the person who took the life, that person transforming their life. And restitution and transformative dialogue between people on both sides of the incident were also more popular answers than prison. And I want to point out this is not an anomaly. So it's been referenced before, but national survey data from the Crime Survivors Speak report, which was put out by the Alliance for Safety and Justice, show that victims of many types of crime prefer more preventative approaches that invest in community over long prison sentences, and that they would rather see people held accountable through a variety of means, not just prison. We also asked a few key questions of people who knew that the person who killed their loved one was incarcerated as a result. And so for context, that was about half of the folks who responded to our survey. We asked them whether the incarceration of the person who killed their loved one contributed towards their safety or contributed towards their healing. Most people disagreed with those. And then when we asked them a question from the OVA survey about how much time should pass before the person who killed their loved one should be considered for release. And our results are flipped from theirs. So instead of overwhelming support for perpetual punishment, in our survey, 94% of respondents indicated that the person who killed their loved one should be eligible for release at some point, with sizable chunks of people saying that that should happen after 10 to 15 years, 15 to 25 years, and 25 to 35 years. So what should we take away from these results? So to start, we need to reconsider narratives about who a victim is and what they want. So yes, some people impacted by violence want harsh punishment for the person who took their loved one's life, and we saw a little bit of that in our survey as well. But we need to recognize that victims are not a monolith. The folks who answered our survey have complex, many-sided stories to tell, and we need to be ready to listen to all of them, not just the ones that justify punitive sentencing. And in fact, most of the people we surveyed tell us that Pennsylvania's main response to violence, which is death by incarceration sentencing, isn't working for them. It isn't helping to heal individuals and communities, it doesn't bring safety, and just like the title of our report, justice can go hand in hand with second chances. So we should listen to this wisdom from folks who have experienced both sides. In the report, we recommend that the Pennsylvania General Assembly pass legislation to end death by incarceration. We also recommend that the state divest from incarceration more broadly and invest in healing the people and communities most impacted by violence through things like restorative justice programs, reentry programs, trauma healing programs, quality education, and more. And then lastly, we also recommend that the Office of the Victim Advocate take an approach centered in supporting individuals and communities most impacted by violence, including dual victims, as well as advocating for second chances, restorative justice, and healing for all Pennsylvanians.
Thanks, Sonia. But before you leave, does anyone have any questions? We want to take a minute before we have our representative speak. Sorry to hold y'all up. Are there any questions people have about the data of the survey? Just give you a chance to ask that while we're here. You can also ask us afterwards. We're not going anywhere. Great. With that, I'm going to invite up Representative Donna Bullock to speak.
Thank you, Jake and Sonia, for sharing the data, and for all of the data nerds. I'm sure they'll dig into the report later on today. Also want to thank Martha and Pastor Jimenez for sharing their testimony as well. My name is State Representative Donna Bullock. I'm the chair of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus. And this particular report for my members of the Black Caucus is somewhat of a capstone on issues that many of the members have been advocating for. It confirms a lot of what we have been talking about in Harrisburg, trying to make sure our colleagues understood what justice looks like in our communities. And often a challenge for us to do that because the narrative around punishments and narrative around justice has been shaped by others outside of our community for so long. And so I want to thank those who participated in this survey, because you gave us the armor we need, the weapons we need, the tools we need to continue to advocate for legislation like compassionate release, that some of my colleagues have introduced, and other legislation around parole eligibility and life without, or changing the stance on life without parole. As much as this report is about a crossroads between, the crossroads where justice and healing meets, it is also about second chances, and I will say first chances. What you have heard, I believe, in Martha's comments and in others is that when folks are arrested, they don't go to jail alone. That it impacts their entire family and often their entire community, because we lose someone that was a part of that system, part of that ecosystem, part of that network of humans. 80,000 children in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania have a parent in our state correctional institutions. 80,000 children. What you have to understand is how that impacts a child who does not have their parent within their household. I grew up with a parent incarcerated in a state facility in New Jersey. And I would tell you that it was a constant relationship, letter writing, visits that kept our relationship strong, that helped my father parent from within. But that doesn't always happen, particularly if you're 2, 3, 4 hours away from your family. Particularly if visits are stopped because of a pandemic, or if there's other resources that prevents a family from staying connected from outside and within. But then when you take that 80,000 children and you start to look at some of our current institutions, and you might find an anecdote here or there, and there's even a few within my own family of family members serving together. A father who meets his 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old son for the first time when that child has now committed an offense and sentenced to the same facility as their father. Of brothers serving time together, and maybe may have been the only time they've lived together because they may have been in foster care from the outside. In fact, you may even find anecdotes of folks who are serving time for shooting someone and then meets the brother or the younger brother of the person they shot while they're on the inside. So these stories of dual victimhood are very real. And we have to understand, when we remove parents from the household through mass incarceration for years, we are failing the children that they leave behind because they didn't have the first chance to build a relationship with their parent. They didn't have the first chance to be successful and to have the connections that they need with a parent to grow and to develop and to mature into contributing citizens in our Commonwealth. Every year, I try to host some event around Gun Violence Survivors Week, which is in early February. And I hear some of these stories. And I would tell you, not once have I heard from those survivors that they want to see someone die in prison. Often it is about using the tools of healing, addressing trauma in our community. Often it is about restorative justice. Often it is about, I just want to talk to them. I want to sit at the table and maybe I can say something to help them turn their life around. That is often what survivors and families want after experiencing the loss of a loved one to gun violence, or the loss of a loved one mentally to some other violence. Because we have to understand, we lose loved ones in many different forms. So, again, I want to say thank you for this report, for the tools, for the weapons, I'll say, that we need to go back into battle on the House floor and on the Senate floor to fight for bills that we believe will give our communities first chances, that we believe will ensure the second chances, and if necessary, the third chance. Because sometimes we need a little bit more help to get it right. Just a little bit more help. And so again, thank you for everyone who put some work into this report. I know that the Black Caucus will use it, and we will make sure that it gets some sunlight here within the Capitol. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic on to my colleague, Representative Rick Krajewski.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am State Representative Rick Krajewski of the 188th District. I want to start off by thanking all the organizations that have put on this event and launched this survey: Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration, Straight Ahead, Healing Communities PA, and Victim Witness Services of South Philadelphia. You have brought the data and the evidence to the things that we already know from our direct experiences, which is that we don't need people to die in prison, and we don't need to circulate, to perpetuate a culture of violence and retribution in response to the harm and pain that our communities have had to deal with, right? And when I was thinking about my remarks for this conference, I was thinking about how because of the rise of homicides and murders that we've seen in our city, a lot of us have become dual victims, right? A lot of us in that definition of who a loved one is has become expansive. Sometimes it's a son, sometimes it's a cousin, a brother, sometimes it's a community leader, an elder, a schoolmate. And when I was thinking about the person that I wanted to keep in mind in thinking about how I was impacted by gun violence, I thought of a young youth organizer that some folks in this room are familiar with. His name was Terence Williams. And he was an organizer of 3-star self-empowerment projects. And he was unfortunately murdered at the young age of 22 years old. And when I think about his life and think about how his fire was cut too short and far too soon, I don't wish for his perpetrator to live his entire life behind a cell. I don't wish for him to die by incarceration. I want justice, I want closure, I want restoration, but we in this room know that having someone die in prison isn't the road to death, right? Because we know that a lot of us also have loved ones who are spending their entire lives in prison, cut away from their families, their communities, their loved ones or family members, and that is only creating more trauma in response to trauma. And that's not a path to justice, it's not a path to compassion, that's just a path to perpetuating the culture that we find ourselves in right now. And we know, because of our direct experience, that the only way to break that cycle is with compassion. No one deserves to die in prison. Everyone deserves, as Chairwoman Bullock said, a first chance at being whole. And what we're seeing is, right, this response to this value of vengeance that we had in our carceral system. We must harm in response to being harmed. It is so ingrained that it's actually written in the Pennsylvania Code that the goal of sentencing is retribution. It's actually written in the law around our carceral system. So how can we be surprised when people in our community try to exact their own form of retribution? Right, when we haven't actually given another definition for justice and accountability and restoration. But we can change that. We can change the culture of justice, we can change that culture of closure, of reconciliation, but it has to start here. It has to start with changing the laws that govern our carceral system. And that is why bills like SB 135 and SB 835 are so important, because they can be our first step in the leadership we need to not just end mass incarceration, but also end the culture of violence that is perpetuating in our communities. And so that is why I am here in full support of the impacted community members here, of the results from this survey, and I ask that we heed their call and follow their leadership. Let's pass SB 835. Let's end death by incarceration. And let's provide the kind of justice and healing that our communities deserve. Thank you.
I want to thank all the organizations, CADBI, Straight Ahead, and others that participated. I want to thank the prior speakers, including but not limited to my colleagues. And when Representative Krajewski began his remarks, and he said that given the rash of violence, that when we started this discussion about dual victims, it meant one thing. Then over the process of it, many of us have become dual victims. You know, it's interesting. I've stood here and talked about dual victims over and over again. This is the first time it just dawned on me that I'm speaking as a dual victim. On July 4th, 2021, Saladin Mahmoud, my nephew, we call him actually my wife's cousin, was murdered in Philadelphia. So I am now a relative of a homicide victim, and still, as many of you know, have relatives who are serving time in prison. So the debate about dual victims with the previous victims advocate was one where I was at the forefront of that debate with her. She said they didn't exist. Unfortunately, I can now have a personal testimony that they do, and I'm one of them. You know, when you say dual victims come out of a system in a community, because where the violence occurs, it occurs. If you're in those communities, you recognize that the reason that people tend to be victimized is because of just where they are, more than who they are or what they're doing. And the reason that people are likely to become incarcerated for violent crime also, the largest, is highly correlated with where you are. I visited prisons, the county jails in Philadelphia, in the beginning of the year, until COVID allowed, every year for 2 decades. Starting with the tradition my father started. And when we ask where people come from, invariably they come from the same neighborhoods. And the same thing is true as you travel around state correctional institutions across the Commonwealth. The same communities, year in and year out, decade in and decade out. And so if you're a person from one of those communities, like I am, from North Philadelphia, you recognize that the system of mass incarceration has not made us safer. I worry about my sons that hung out with their cousin that was killed, but I don't think that they're safer because we have mass incarceration. It doesn't make them any safer. As a matter of fact, most of us know that the mass incarceration system has only perpetrated and generated a climate of additional violence, and it has not made us safer. So when you talk to victims, particularly dual victims, the first thing they want to know is, what can we do to make communities safer? And taking a person, because the debate around for people who've committed homicides isn't a debate about whether or not a person who commits a homicide gets locked up at all. The number of years that were discussed here, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, are all very long periods of time. Invariably, you spend that kind of time in jail, there is a real possibility you're going to come out a different person. Over that period of time, in or out of jail, we tend to evolve. The one thing that is constant is change. And these bills acknowledge the fact that people can grow and people can change. They create an opportunity for people to prove themselves, because you still have to go before the Board of Probation and Parole and be heard. They create an opportunity for people who are locked up to have an incentive to want to be better. And in the process of their becoming better as persons, they are they're going to be better parents. So as Representative Bullock pointed out, they're going to be sending letters back and forth and influencing behaviors in communities for people who are not incarcerated. My mom used to have this poem that she said to my dad when I was a kid, and then later to me as a parent, and now to my son, because I'm a grandparent to his children. And she called it my little boy who follows me. She said, my little boy who follows me, he watches everything I do and say, I know I must not go astray, for fear he'll go the self-same way. My little boy that follows me. It's a very simple poem, but it was basically saying, at a very human level, young people mimic the behaviors we create, and they listen to people that are their role models. And if your role models, in fact, if you're an old head, homie, father, uncle, the person you looked up to is incarcerated and made some bad choices, the person in the best position to let the next generation not make those choices is an incarcerated person who can speak to them and say, listen, I did that and it was a bad move. Don't do it. You don't want to be here. But they can also, but to the extent that that person is home and talking to people in their communities, in many cases, I've watched folks return to North Philadelphia. Some of the juvenile lifers have returned. People like Bobby Harris have become beacons of hope for people. And they talk to people and inspire them to do the right thing. There's so many other juvenile lifers that are doing the same thing. I'll tell you, everyone wants some level of justice and closure, as was suggested. They want there to be a trial, they want people to sell. They want there to be some level of incarceration, but nobody believes, or at least the people I talk to, the vast majority of folks don't believe that having a system where every human being who commits a homicide will never see the light of day is done us justice thus far. It has not made us safer, and they don't believe that it's the path forward. So speaking for myself and for so many others who this survey represents, it is time that we recognize the true communities that are impacted by violence, the true communities that are impacted by the disparities in the criminal justice system, and recognize that reforming one is reforming both. And it is not a duality as to whether we make communities safer or, in fact, enhance criminal justice reform. But by enhancing a criminal justice system and having a system that people can believe in, that people can respect, we are, in fact, going to make communities safer. And that, more than anything else, is what dual victims want. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Street, Representative Krajewski, and Chairwoman Bullock. I know that we're running on capital time, which means that we started late and need to end early. But we have two more dual victims who are here to speak, and I want to hold some more space for them. So you can stick around for a little bit longer, and then we'll wrap up. We want to hear from Amy Mcandrews, coming from Chester County, and then Lisa Village.
Hey, thank you for allowing me the time to speak today. Almost 25 years ago, in June 1997, my world was rocked when I received a phone call that my dear friend, who I considered my baby brother, was lying dead in a car. He was executed, shot once in the neck and twice in the head. My 16-year-old brother and his cousin, both with their lives ahead of them, one with a new baby, were gone at the hands of other people in the most brutal way. For nearly 25 years, I experienced many emotions: anger, sadness, grief, even guilt, wondering if I had stayed out with my little brother too late the night before. Maybe he would have been asleep that morning. I despised those men. I wished them no goodwill. In 1998, yet another friend was murdered, an apparent rubber gone wrong. His dead body in a casket, as I bent to kiss his cold cheek, is still etched in my mind. Fast forward 18 years, and I began to gain a serious interest in the criminal justice system. Astounded at the amount of innocent people in prison, I began to speak out. Something must be done. We are putting people to death. We are incarcerating to death. And in too many cases, actually innocent people are caged. Through this journey, I have met guilty people, whether they were an accomplice who happened to be at a crime scene or an actual perpetrator. Too often, society does not know the facts. Those at the defense table not often testifying or taking a plea to save their own lives. I've gotten to know many convicted murderers over the years, many with families who love them. and staff who have seen the growth. I've gotten to know guilty as well as innocent, truly innocent, while perpetrators are free to walk amongst us. I've also been a victim of personal crime. Despite this, I believe people change. I believe everyone should be given a second look. I come to you with sincerity and an open mind. I have personally seen and endured horrible things, having not just one or two, but 3 people I love murdered. While I have endured grief and sadness and have felt pain I do not wish on anyone, I know life without parole is not the solution. I've not met the guilty, I've met the innocent, and I've heard their stories, seen their growth and accomplishments, and I embrace them. Many I want to hug after hearing stories of their lives and the hell they endured well before the first decision they made of their life. Nearly all endured extreme poverty, drug abuse, mental health issues, or abuse. In 2018, I lost yet another dear friend, a lifetime paramedic and state constable, elected and sworn law enforcement officer, a mentor to all ages. His killer was convicted, but didn't spend a night in prison, 15 months probation on house arrest, and $3,455.55 in court fees and restitution for the justice we saw. After losing people to the hands of others, you may want me to support life without parole. That is the very last thing I would want. My loved ones are gone, and no amount of steel or concrete can bring them home. We can no longer tolerate a spiteful and vengeful criminal justice system that forces people no alternative but to die in prison. Many of these people, men and women, have cried a million tears, screamed silent screams, and died 1,000 times over. So many failed by a very flawed system, whether it was a juvenile placement system, such as foster care, that ultimately lost them, or an adult court of law. We're all imperfect people, yet I do not believe most are incorrigible. We all change by the day, let alone decades. My heart hurts for my losses, for the blood relatives of those who have a seat at an empty table. But my heart also hurts for men and women who will not see a free society because our laws speak for few. Our lawmakers uphold laws on the belief that all surviving family members want the worst sentence. You now know this is not true. The current laws of Pennsylvania treat everyone the same. Once they are convicted, yet just as we are all different, these caged humans are all different. Many work longer at rehabilitation and redemption for longer than they were alive before entering prison. One person, the district attorney, determines what a person will be charged with. Once the verdict is handed down, it is nearly impossible to reverse course. A prosecutor has the ultimate say. It takes a panel of judges to remand a sentence, and it's all based on case law, not individual merit. The Board of Pardons, which requires 5 individuals to grant mercy. A jury of 12 has the ability to hand down life without parole based on one event, yet hundreds of staff members to know the true character of these people for every other 365 days of their life over decades have no say. Nearly every other state in the United States offers opportunities for redemption. We're not asking for everyone to go free. We're asking that people who are deserving have an opportunity at parole. Incarcerating people to death does not do my heart justice. It does not make me safer or happier. It does not benefit me in any positive way mentally, and it is a detriment to me financially through unnecessary tax dollars that could be utilized for mental health or drug treatment. Money that could be used to fight poverty or be offered to the Office of Victims Advocates to truly help survivors. I humbly ask our lawmakers to open our hearts and minds to pass laws which afford an opportunity for the deserving to imagine as your own family member is behind these laws. I ask you to sign on to SB 135 for parole eligibility or SB 835 for geriatric parole for those aged 55 and older. Thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Lisa Volachin. I come from the state of New Jersey. My husband is serving life without parole, plus 6 to 12. So I'm guessing when he's dead, we're going to put him in a body bag and wheel him back in to serve that 6 to 12. I'm also a victim of 2 murders. one when I was 21, and one in 2019, which is my former husband. I witnessed the murder when I was 21, and I can tell you it was the most horrific thing that ever happened to me. I wanted the death penalty. You couldn't execute it fast enough. Firing squad, hang him. I didn't care how you did it. I wanted it done. And then in 1999, the death penalty was brought to my family. My husband was 19 and was served papers stating the state wanted to seek the death penalty. One thing I need people to understand is, even though we're victims, we have a voice. The Office of Victims Advocate needs to stop speaking for us. Those of us that have healed, those of us that choose to forgive, it's a choice. I don't want to live the rest of my life hating somebody for something that happened when he was a teenager. I've made my peace with the man that killed my cousin. Unfortunately, my ex-husband, his murderer hasn't been found. It's a little tough, but when they do find him, he gets forgiveness. In order to forgive, you have to stop being angry. You have to stop wanting revenge. I've learned to do that. And one thing I will say, and I'm probably the oddest dual victim in history, I believe once somebody goes to prison as a victim, I no longer have the right to interfere in their rehabilitation. I don't have the right to interfere to keep them from coming home. If the state believes that they've changed, that they've redeemed themselves, then they deserve a second chance. In 2024, the man that murdered my cousin is up for parole. And I can guarantee you I will be standing there in front of the New Jersey State Parole Board telling them it's time to let him go. I'm not his judge, not his jury, and I'm not his executioner. Has he changed? Maybe, maybe not. It's not my business. It's up to the state to decide whether he changed. Putting people away for life, bringing the death penalty to the table, it doesn't solve anything. I don't feel any safer. And I live in the suburbs of New Jersey. I'm not anywhere remotely near urban areas. I'm at the border of eastern Pennsylvania. What people need to understand is when you stop becoming a victim and you become a survivor, the power that you have over the people that took those lives is amazing. It is an amazing feeling to forgive. Forgiveness is a gift. It's not for everybody. If you choose, you choose. I chose to forgive and move on. And here I am now fighting for my husband's life. He's 42 years old. I'm fighting for his life, fighting to change a law in a state I don't live in, with laws I don't understand, because in New Jersey, 30 to life, you have an option to seek parole. Whether they let you go or not is a whole other story. But your state, stop weaponizing victims. Stop using us as weapons. You put us on a shelf, you take us off when somebody is up for parole or somebody's going to court, you take us down, you use us. You use us. You keep us in a circle of perpetual victimhood. Enough is enough. We exist. They acknowledge me as a dual victim in New Jersey. Pennsylvania needs to do that too. Stop weaponizing victims. Not all of us feel the same way. Not all of us are angry and vengeful. You need to listen to every victim, not just the ones that suit your cause. Thank you.
I'm going to go slightly off script here and just say that part of what doing this survey and writing this report has meant for me is just the realization that listening to the stories of dual victims is a sacred practice for me. And I just feel like we spent some time there. I'm a Christian, y'all took me to church. And so I think that is ultimately behind all these posters and these voices and the glossy reports. That's what we're asking, is for the voices of dual victims, for the families who live at this heartbreaking intersection, to be centered in the conversation about how we deal with violence, how we heal, and what justice means in the Commonwealth. So I want to thank our elected officials who came and spoke. I want to thank all of the dual victims. I want to thank the press for being here, members of the OVA, thank you so much, and everyone who came together to make this possible. Thank you for your time today. We'll be around if you have any questions. Yeah. Second chances don't diminish justice. They fulfill it. Let's make it happen.